Bible Worm, reading the Bible with Bible Worm.
Welcome to Bible Worm, getting to the core of the biblical text. I'm Dr. Robert Williamson, professor of religious studies at Hendrix College and theologian in residence of Canvas Community in Little Rock, Arkansas.
And I'm Dr. Amy Robertson, Director of Lifelong Learning and Music at Congregation Or Hadash in Sandy Springs, Georgia. We're here every week to discuss the biblical text, both as biblical scholars and as people of faith, one Jewish, one Christian.
This week we're reading Luke 7:18-35. John the Baptist has been in prison since Jesus' baptism, so he hasn't been able to witness any of Jesus' ministry for himself. Now he sends his disciples to Jesus to ask him if he is really the Messiah or if John should look for another. Imagine John, the great disciple preparing the way for the Lord, suddenly doubting his faith in Jesus. Rather than make a declaration to John, Jesus tells him that the blind see, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news proclaimed to them. That should be enough, Jesus seems to say. Among all our squabbles about who Jesus is or isn't, who he should be or shouldn't be, all that matters is that the hurting are being healed and that the poor are receiving good news. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Amy, it's Bible Worm time.
Good morning, Bobby.
Good morning. Amy, the text this week is going to be a really interesting text, I think. It's about John the Baptist, who we met, back in chapter 1 and then again in chapter 3. We met fetus John in chapter 1, and then we met grown-up kind of fire and brimstone
fetus John and then grown-up living in the woods
3.
John. Yeah, eating crickets. Mm-hmm.
John's been in jail, you remember, since chapter 3, and in this text, he's going to come back and wonder if Jesus is really
Who's
the
that
Messiah.
guy?
Yeah. Are you sure you're the Messiah? So we're in Luke chapter 7, verses 18 through 35 today. We're just picking up one verse after where we were last time, but are there things we should remind ourselves of or things we should be thinking about before we get into this text?
I mean, we just had the last section of this chapter that we read had 2 miraculous healings in it, one of which was a resurrection of someone who had actually died.
Yeah. One
of which was the healing of the centurion slave that was done remotely.
Yeah, it was like a COVID healing. That was like it was like a Zoom healing.
It was a COVID healing. It was a Zoom. Yeah. It was facilitated over Zoom without words.
Yeah.
So that's, just sort of that we already had miracles and healing, and it seems like they are, those are 2 pretty, growing edges.
Yeah.
there's the growing edges here. Bobby, the other thing I'll say, and I think this might just be a me thing, it probably is, I don't remember this section of text. I don't remember reading it before. I imagine that we have read it before, but I don't remember it, which is kind of exciting to me to be encountering a text for what feels like the first time. See how nice it is to be getting old and senile?
Yeah, I had the same feeling when I was starting to read this text that we had not talked about it before. And so I went back and looked, and in fact, 4 years ago when we did the Luke cycle, Easter was earlier. And so this week's text, and I think also next week's text, were not in the narrative lectionary. So in fact, you are not old and senile.
Or this is not evidence of that.
This is not evidence. This does not add to the case of your age and senility. This is actually a text that we have not read together before, which is kind of fun because, now that we sort of, even though we don't really go back and listen to old episodes, you still, it's still in you someplace and you kind of say the same things. And this time, I don't know what to say about this text.
Awesome. Amy, well, that's exciting.
I was mentioning that we've encountered John the Baptist a couple times before. It's, you remember in that text that we read in Luke chapter 1, where Mary is just found out she's pregnant and she goes to Elizabeth, who is 6 months pregnant with John. And when Mary says hi, John jumps in his mother's womb. It's such a lovely text.
Image. Yeah.
But he recognizes who she is, even though he's like a preborn fetus, he's
Yeah.
like, it's the mother of my Lord.
Yeah.
So that's the first encounter we had with John. The second one was at the baptism. Do you have any like reflections about John looking back at that text and what his baptism was like?
What I remember most, and maybe it's because of the text that is to come, is that, first of all, John not only is baptizing people, but baptizes Jesus.
Right.
But also that he is clear with people that he is not, there is someone coming after him.
Yes.
He's not, don't focus your attention here, guys. There's someone coming after me.
Yes.
And that's what I kept thinking of in reading this passage.
Yeah, so I'm not the one to come.
I'm not the one to come.
Is greater than me. Yeah, that's important. The other thing that we talked about in that baptism text is John's framing of the arrival of the Messiah is pretty fiery about what the arrival of the Messiah was going to be like. There was that language of the axe is at the root of the tree. There was the language of baptized with spirit and fire. There was that language about the winnowing of the wheat and the chaff. And so he had this kind of like, y'all, it's going to be scary. And I remember that because I bristled at it a little bit. Like, that's not the way that I think. I know there are people who think about Jesus that way, but that's not the way I think about Jesus. And so I was a little frustrated with John. With
John's portrayal.
For setting it up that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at the end of that chapter 3 text, Luke told us that John had been thrown into prison because of something involving Herod and Herod's marriage to his brother's ex-wife. I've never quite understood all the details of that. Although Josephus talks about it too, so I think it was an actual thing that actually
it seems like it actually happened. Yeah. Anyway, he winds up in jail.
And he's been in jail since Jesus' ministry began, it seems. And so he hasn't really gotten to encounter Jesus firsthand. So here in this text, he's going to send some disciples to check on things with Jesus. We're in Luke chapter 7, verses 18 to 35, and I'm reading in the Common English Bible. John's disciples informed him about all these things. John called 2 of his disciples and sent them to the Lord. They were to ask him, "Are you the one who is coming, or should we look for someone else?" When they reached Jesus, they said, "John the Baptist has sent us to you. He asks, 'Are you the one who is coming, or should we look for someone else?'" Right then, Jesus healed many of their diseases, illnesses, and evil spirits, and he gave sight to a number of blind people. Then he replied to John's disciples, "Go, report on what you have seen and heard. Those who were blind are able to see. Those who were crippled now walk. People with skin diseases are cleansed. Those who were deaf now hear. Those who were dead are raised up, and good news is preached to the poor. Happy is anyone who doesn't stumble along the way because of me." I'm just so interested in John feeling the need to ask this question. The question's given to us twice, once in the mouth of John, "Are you the one who is coming?" and once in the mouth of his disciples, "Are you the one who's coming?"
Yes, they faithfully delivered the question.
Word for word. Yeah. In the Bible, they don't always do that. Sometimes
they don't always do that. I always look to see. But here, yes.
Can you just talk a little bit about why you think John is needing to ask this question of Jesus?
It's really interesting because, as you were saying, sort of fetus John seemed to know.
Yeah.
And grown man John wants to check. And I wonder, my first thought before you sort of helped me orient back in the other stories we knew of John, my first thought, or maybe my first question is, does he need to do something different if Jesus is the one? Like, is this supposed to be like systems activate, or is it just that he is curious and is trying to direct his mind in the right way?
Now that's an interesting question. And, because John's job, I guess he understood it as his calling was to prepare the way for the Lord. And so
Yeah.
if Jesus is not that one, then John's still got some work to do. You know what I'm saying? And so
Is John still in jail now?
He is, yeah.
He is still in jail. Okay.
Yeah. John never makes it back out of jail, in fact. And so the reason we've got the disciples going back and forth is because John can't go and witness firsthand.
He can't go and witness firsthand. He can't go and talk to Jesus himself. Well, then he better hope Jesus is the one, because I don't know how he's going to do away from jail.
No, I think that's a nice way of reading the motivation of why he's asking. And then the question of like, but why does he now doubt?
Yes.
The way that it sort of resonates for me as like useful is that he had in mind that the Messiah was going to be one kind of Messiah. And it was this fiery, winnowy guy. And Jesus has not been that.
That's not what he's doing.
And so John is like, wait a second, I thought you were.
Yeah.
And now I don't know. That's the way that it has the most energy for me. Is that you too? It sounds like maybe.
No, I think I would not have thought of that if you hadn't sort of taken us back to those early stories, you know, when we started this conversation. But I think that makes a lot of sense. The other thing you're putting in my head, Bobby, is there are all these Jewish stories that I think are probably a little bit later historically, but are so lovely about the things that we imagine that, you know, our souls knew sort of before we come into earth and our bodies.
Oh, yeah.
And that we forget them when we're born.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then, you know, and that just, you can't walk into the world and like know all the things you knew as a soul in some celestial realm. So anyway, that just has me thinking about really maybe fetus John did have more clarity on some of these things than John, who's actually walking around in the world. But
I like that a lot, Amy. And even in a less metaphysical way, like, you know, fetuses at 6 months along do have those kinds of experiences. Like they respond to their mother's voices and they do all of that kind of stuff. You don't have any memory of that, you know, at least
that's right.
I don't. And so I think it is fully possible to have experiences when you're still in the womb that you don't recollect later.
Yeah.
The going betweenness of the disciples, it seems like the disciples of John have been with Jesus, kind of watching what Jesus does and going back and reporting to John.
Yeah, it does.
There is the distance, like you kind of wonder if John could have experienced this himself. Maybe he would have thought something different. But the fact that he's only been able to hear about it secondhand, does that play into your reading?
I mean, I think that makes sense. Look, I will say, maybe this is a funny story to tell, but sometimes I've been in the presence of great teachers. I'm not saying like Jesus level, like maybe Messiah kinds of teachers, but just great spiritual leaders in the world. And I can read their teachings and I can hear about their teachings and they will move me or they won't. But when I have the opportunity to actually be in a space with them and like sit in front of them and be in their presence, for me, it is categorically different. It is, I don't know what to say about it. It is just different.
Yes.
So if I try to sort of import my own experience into this story and say like, John is in prison. He's hearing all this stuff about this teacher that clearly is teacher, prophet. He's doing all this amazing stuff. But as you said, it's not the things that were exactly on his list of what a Messiah was going to do. And he doesn't have access to what you feel in the presence of the leader. Yeah. I think it makes sense that he's a little confused.
Yeah. So John's disciples ask Jesus, and in that Jesus-y way, somebody in the Bible Worms collaborative was like, Jesus can never just give a straight answer, can he?
Nope.
Like, no, that guy does not give straight answers very often.
Even though it's such a straightforward question, I kind of love that John's like, okay, like, is it you?
Is it you? Just tell me.
Is it you?
Yeah.
Just tell me. Like,
So Jesus does not say, it's me,
No.
or, hey, remember, you knew it was me when you were a fetus, or whatever.
Mm-mm.
Instead, he heals a bunch of people, and then he says, go and report what you have seen and heard. And then he has this series of things. Those who are blind see, crippled now walks, people with skin diseases cleansed, deaf hear, dead are raised, good news is preached. So it's like an engaged learning experience or something that Jesus gives here.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you make of that response?
I mean, I feel like there is not, as far as I know, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, does not have teachings that the Messiah is going to do these things.
Yeah.
There is a sense, I think, that in the time of the Messiah, there can be these like magnificent reversals, including some kind of resurrection after destruction, maybe resurrection of the dead. It's a little unclear in the Hebrew Bible whether that's a metaphor or whether we're actually talking, fine. So I feel like he has in some ways dodged the question again. Like he has said, we are in this time, this time of reversals that we have spoken about. We're clearly in it, and I am actively like bringing it about.
Yes.
But I don't think that's what the Hebrew Bible led us to expect, that the Messiah is going to be personally carrying out, healings and resurrections and stuff like that.
That's so interesting because it's like there's a dispute here about the job description of the Messiah.
There absolutely is, yeah.
And so John had one kind of a vision back in chapter 3, like it's a judgment of the righteous and the wicked and the separation of the peoples.
Yeah.
And then here's the healing stuff. And it's like Jesus is trying to reorient the job description that John has in his head without just saying, yes, that's me.
Yeah. Yes.
This is what Jesus said he was going to do in his inaugural sermon in Luke 4, when he's at Nazareth, where he goes back and takes that Isaiah 61 passage and says, today this is fulfilled in your hearing. This echoes that, in which he kind of said, this is what I'm going to do as the Messiah. But maybe this is not exactly the expectation that people had at the moment for what the Messiah was going to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of the things that he mentions here are things that have come up very specifically in Isaiah in different places, that these things are going to happen.
Yes.
But like, just to take one example, the deaf shall hear. If he is referencing Isaiah 29:18, that as the deaf shall hear even written words. Like that in the context in the Hebrew Bible, it sort of is, it seems much more like a metaphor to me, like impossible things will happen.
Yes.
And so it's really interesting to think about what it means here in this really like sort of concretized way. This is decidedly not a metaphor for Jesus.
Or at least it's not only a metaphor.
It's not only a metaphor. Okay, yes.
It is possible to read the references there to the blind will see and the deaf will hear as having a metaphorical component, right? Those who have been unable to see what the Messiah is, or those who have been unable to understand what the scriptures are saying about the Messiah as Jesus understands it, are going to be able to see and they're going to be able to hear. But he is also being very concrete. Actual deaf people are actually going to be able to hear. Actual blind people are going to be able to see.
Yeah. Bobby, I'm so moved here by the inclusion of the poor will have good news.
Yes.
Brought to them.
Yeah.
I mean, these other, I guess not all of the examples seem totally impossible, but, okay, impossible maybe is maybe not the right word for this context and this audience, but the dead are raised or the deaf shall hear. It's like there's something fundamental about the state that you are in that makes it impossible for that other thing to happen. It cannot happen.
Yeah.
And the idea that there is something fundamental about being poor that means that there is not good news. Like, I don't know that I should take it quite such a strong parallel that way, but I don't know. It really, it kind of stopped me in my tracks to think about really how all-encompassing it can be to really live in poverty and have to figure out moment to moment how you're going to survive and protect your people. And I don't know. I'm maybe taking it too concretely just because of the list of things that it's in, but it was arresting to me.
The other thing I love about that is it comes right after. Like it's like we're ramping up, right? And we get to the dead being raised, and you think like, how much better can it get than that? And then it's the next thing is good news is preached to the poor. It's like the culmination of the thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Gosh, that really draws out what is the power of the empire to structure the life, this limited life on earth that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. That's wild.
That reference there to good news to the poor is the place where you're, like, if you haven't heard it yet, that's the place where your head should click back to that Nazareth sermon in chapter 4. Yeah. Jesus is really just saying, I said what I was going to do. John didn't get to hear that sermon because he was in jail, but I said what I was going to do. I've been doing it for the last 3 chapters, and now I'm reminding you that that's what I said I was going to do, and here's the evidence of what the Messiah is, even if it's not the evidence you were expecting. Jesus then in verse 23 says, happy is anyone who doesn't stumble along the way because of me. The word there in Greek is skandalizo, like is not scandalized by me or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, how do you read that verse?
My translation is happy is anyone who takes no offense at me.
Yeah.
Which feels really different.
Yeah.
I guess what I see in that is you have to have a certain flexibility in your mindset of what you think is possible in the world and what is not.
Yeah.
Because if you're kind of rigid in that, like, the world is as it is and there's not much new under the sun, then the things that Jesus is doing will be sort of a stumbling place or offend, or you'll just refuse them. Like, you won't be able to take that in. How do you think about it?
I like that a lot. When Jesus was presented in the temple when he was an infant, Simeon had said he was destined for the rising and falling of many. And I think this can be read that way, is that people are going to get tripped up about Jesus. We saw the people of Nazareth get tripped up about Jesus when he said, I'm going to do these things, but I'm not going to do it for you. I'm going to do it for people you don't expect. Now here's John the Baptist. Like, John the Baptist, man, he's getting tripped up about whether Jesus is or isn't fulfilling the job description of the Messiah. And so, like, the way Jesus is being Messiah is hard to get your head around, and it can be disruptive for people. And Jesus, I think, is just saying a little bit like, just like, let it be what it is. Like, let it wash over you. Just receive it and don't ask too many questions. Don't pick at it too much. Maybe is how you would read it. Because, this is what he says to John the Baptist's disciples, right? And so it seems like there's a little bit of an encouragement for John to not get offended.
I love that. I love that idea of sort of let it wash over you, let it unfold. Like, you don't have to fit this into your systems immediately and accept it or reject it and, like, sort of intellectually analyze it. And I think that's a good instruction often.
Hi, my name is John Weicker, and I am the Associate Pastor for Youth and Their Families at First Presbyterian Church of Durham, North Carolina. I am a Bible Worm supporter at the Bible Worm supporter level, $48 per year. And I do that not because we're on the narrative lectionary or even because I preach that often, although when I do preach and the texts line up, I certainly use the podcast. I actually use Bible Worm as my own personal devotion for the week. I'm someone who misses the deep theology and close reading of texts that I got to do a lot of in seminary. And in Bobby and Amy's work, I found that again. And so I listen on Monday mornings on my way over to church, and then Monday afternoons on the way back, as a way to prepare for the week, to do ministry, and to love Jesus and serve. I hope you'll join me in becoming a Bible Worm supporter too. And now back to this week's episode.
It's so interesting that we never really get to see John the Baptist's response to this and whether he was able to hear this message or not hear this message. What we get next is Jesus then talking to the crowds who have sort of gathered around for this conversation. So I will pick up in verse 24.
Mm-hmm.
After John's messengers were gone, Jesus spoke to the crowds about John. What did you go out to the wilderness to see? A stalk blowing in the wind? What did you go out to see? A man dressed up in refined clothes? Look, those who dress in fashionable clothes and live in luxury are in royal palaces. What did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. He is the one of whom it is written, Look, I'm sending my messenger before you, who will prepare your way before you. I tell you that no greater human being has ever been born than John, yet whoever is least in God's kingdom is greater than he. Everyone who heard this, including the tax collectors, acknowledged God's justice because they had been baptized by John. Okay, Amy, this is the part where I began to realize that we never talked about this passage before. Is because I'm like, what are you saying there, Jesus? So how did you start to make your way into what Jesus is saying there?
You know, it's so interesting. Like he's had these messengers from John. I really like that you pointed out at the end of the message he sends back to John, there is this, not a rebuke, but a sort of gentle, you got to relax, John.
Yeah.
You know, like, let it be. But then he turns and gives this sort of, like, honoring speech about John to the crowd who has gathered. And I'm not totally sure what motivates it. Like, do we think that the crowd overheard the conversation and felt critical about John for having asked questions? Or is Jesus just reflecting on John being a good person, even though he's still human? I can't quite tell what the emotional context of this speech is.
I appreciate your saying it that way. I have tended to think about it as the crowd has heard this conversation and maybe John has lost some face or something, or Jesus is afraid that he has, and that the people are now going to say, oh, John the Baptist, he doesn't understand.
He didn't get it. Yeah.
And so Jesus is saying, no, like you yourselves know. Like you went out to listen to him in the wilderness. Why'd you do that? Not because he's a fancy pants, but because you know that prophets say stuff in the wilderness. So like he's a prophet. He's more than a prophet. And then he's the fulfillment of scripture. And there he quotes Malachi 3:1, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you, which has some resonance also with Exodus 23 and that messenger that goes in front of the Israelite people too, maybe. So I do think this is Jesus vouching for John. And it's so interesting what he sort of said, John has stumbled a little bit. John, don't stumble. Yeah. And then he said, but John is the greatest of the humans that has ever been. And so there's this sort of interesting, like even the greatest of the humans that has ever been is still prone to tripping up over Jesus.
I really appreciate that context, Bobby, and I love it being in here. And I don't always think of Jesus as someone who's particularly patient with people not understanding who he is. So it feels particularly, I don't know, warm or sweet or something that he is saying like, no, we have to give him a little leeway. Like he is the one who came before me and prepared the way. He has done and is doing hard work for this cause. And don't come out swinging against our own.
Yeah, I like that a lot. This line where he says, So no human being has ever been born greater than John. So he's the best of them all.
Yeah.
But then he flips it in that last line that he speaks. Yet whoever is least in God's kingdom is greater than he.
Yeah.
So you have this sort of sense of like, there's two categories. He's the greatest of the human category, the least of the whatever that other category is, God's kingdom category. Can you tell me how you're thinking through that?
You know, in its context here, the way I understood it was sort of there's sort of like two different classes. Like there's like humans can only get so far, I guess, so high in the system. And then if you think of sort of divine beings or something like that the least of the divine beings is higher than John. So John is not like the ceiling of all things, but for full-on humans, John is our exemplar. But I have to say, aren't there all these other places in the gospel? I have to ask, really, I don't have to say, where in the kingdom of God, it's more like once God's idea of how things should be really comes to be on earth, comes to fruition, then sort of like the least become the greatest. And so the poor will, all the systems are inverted. And if I think about it in that way, it doesn't make sense to me anymore. So how are you thinking about this in the context of that sort of the least will be the greatest in the kingdom of God? Or are you thinking about it like angels or other divine beings?
So the angels or other divine beings to me is the most straightforward way to read it, but also the one that I think doesn't get you really anywhere.
Yeah.
Like, angels are greater than humans. Like, okay. Thank you. And so I sort of think maybe that's not what Jesus is saying.
Yeah.
The second way that one could think about it is there's like a dividing line there. And John made it all the way to the top of the dividing line, but he didn't get it. And so what Jesus is saying is the people who got it, even though they might be tax collectors and sinners or whatever, are greater than John, who has not yet gotten it. That reading makes me a little sad because I feel like John gets it. He just hasn't quite gotten it all the way, but I mean, come on, like nobody's getting it all the way.
Interesting.
The third way of reading it is the sort of flipping way that you're reading it, which is to say John is the greatest here in this sort of the empire of the world. But when we get to the empire of heaven, Mary told us there's going to be a reversal and everybody's going to flip. And it's going to be the people who are on the bottom in this current age are going to be on the top in that one. So John, who is greatest here, is going to be the least of all on the kingdom of heaven side. But I don't know that that's a dig at John.
I don't know but that doesn't even really make sense because John, is John really that powerful in this world? He's in jail. Like he lives in the woods
true.
and eats
He
bugs
lived
and
in
then
the
he gets thrown
wilderness.
in jail. Like,
he was already inhabiting the kingdom of heaven in some way. Yeah. I mean, Jesus has said of himself that he will be the least and servant of all in the kingdom of heaven, So
that's true. That's true.
I'm not entirely clear what Jesus is after there, just to be perfectly frank. But I think those are some of the options anyway.
I'm really curious about the middle idea you presented, that the folks who are maybe in Jesus's hearing right now, who don't sort of bristle at, or who don't get hung up on the question of whether he's really the one, that they can sort of ascend higher on this proverbial scale. And yet he's not critical of John for not being able to do that.
When you say it that way, that idea really does have legs, that John has some idea in his head that does not allow him to understand who Jesus is. But some of the tax collectors and sinners and people who Jesus has been with, they don't have those categories.
Right.
And so there's nothing to trip them up. And so they just accept Jesus as he is. And I like reading it that way. I feel a little bad for John in that reading.
Well, and I do feel bad for John in that reading. And also it's, I don't know, interesting or strange to me then that verse says all the people who heard this, including the tax collectors, acknowledged the justice of God because they had been baptized with John's baptism.
Right.
So like John opened a door for them that he may not have fully gone through himself.
Yeah. That's beautiful. You know, Amy, that line, the CEB has it the same way. Acknowledge God's justice or the justice of God. Mm-hmm. The Greek actually says they justified God, which I think makes you uncomfortable because, like, what does it mean to justify God? Like, God is the self-justified one. And so the translations try to sort of work around that a little bit. When I was thinking about this idea of they justified God, I mean, the closest I can get to it is God seems to be doing some stuff in this gospel that was not really expected that God would do, which is lifting up all these folks who are sort of on the outside of the establishment religion. And that's like, it seems like, why would God do that? Or would God do that? But there's some idea that those who actually have been baptized by John and changed their hearts and minds are demonstrating that God actually can and should do that. And so this sort of alternative way of God working at the margins is being justified by the lives of the people who got baptized by John. Mm-hmm. That's where my head is going with that right now. Do you have a way of thinking about what that means? Or would you rather read it as the justice of God?
No, I think I like the way that you're reading it, Bobby. My translation also, the NRSV, offers that alternative, they praised God, which, again, trying to get around the idea of justifying God because that makes us uncomfortable. But I really like the idea that, yes, because their life unfolds the way it does, and they're able to move faithfully sort of between what had seemed like really like categorical divisions and boundaries between ideas or peoples or whatever, that itself is a demonstration of the reality of God or something like that.
So at this point, Jesus has commended the tax collectors and those folks. But picking up in verse 30, he's going to criticize at least some of the Pharisees as is Jesus's way. So I'll pick up there. But the Pharisees and legal experts rejected God's will for themselves because they hadn't been baptized by John. To what will I compare the people of this generation? Jesus asked. What are they like? They are like children sitting in the marketplace calling out to each other. We played the flute for you and you didn't dance. We sang a funeral song and you didn't cry. John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say he has a demon. Yet the human one came eating and drinking, and you say, look, a glutton and a drunk, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved to be right by all her descendants. The way that Luke interprets the Pharisees and legal experts is they rejected God's will for themselves by not being baptized by John. That phrasing is so interesting to me. They rejected God's will for themselves. You have thoughts about that?
You know, there's this, I'm sure you have heard this story. I guess it's a midrash. I don't know, but that there's this, no, it's not, I don't think it is a midrash. Anyway, there's this guy named Zusha. Have you heard the story of Zusha?
I don't know Zusha, no.
There's just this story that he was a very dramatic character. And he would say when he dies and goes to heaven, God is not going to say, why were you not more like Moses? Or why were you not more like Elijah? God is going to say, why were you not more like Zusha? Like you are so, you have your own thing that you are supposed to be like, and you need to pay attention to it. But it is possible not to pay attention to it.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, we were talking before about how, in a way, what held John back, even though John got quite far and maybe fulfilled his path, I don't know. But that he had some definitions of things that had gotten too rigid in his mind, and they made it hard for him to go further in his understanding of the world that was coming on. And I feel like there's some of that same critique in here, like the Pharisees and the lawyers who are known for being very precise and sort of intellectual, and they have definitions of things, and they're gonna think it through compared to what we've known before. It's that becomes for them a stumbling block, so they're attached to those ideas and can't actually follow the call that is meant for them because they're so attuned to that other stuff.
I really like that way of reading it, Amy, to connect the Pharisees and the legal experts to John. And so, in the New Testament, often the Pharisees and the legal experts are like the foils. And so we're like, oh yeah, of course they didn't get it. But here, I love that. But also John seems to have done something kind of similar. And it's about preconceived ideas that become a stumbling block. And that has happened in both cases. I also really love that becoming the full version of yourself, or be more like yourself. Mm-hmm. Back in that baptism text where John was baptizing everyone, he said, don't say of yourself, I'm a child of Abraham, or whatever that line was, because God can raise up children of Abraham from these stones. And, the sense of that really was, you can't claim special status just because of who your people are, or, some sense of chosenness, but you've got to do the stuff. You got to, be fully yourself, not rely on somebody else's category or whatever. And I like that way of thinking about it too. This is like moving us beyond the idea of we belong to category X and therefore God treats us in such a way. Mm-hmm. But God has created us to live in the world in some kind of a way. And that's what we're meant to do. And if we get too hung up on the other stuff, we'll never be able to do that. Amy, you said you were hung up on the first part of that sentence. And so you might have already addressed that, but I'm curious what the specific nature of your hang up might be.
Okay, I'm going to try to explain the way that I first encountered this before this conversation.
Okay.
I was reading it on my own. It read to me, so looking back at verse 29, when we're talking about the tax collectors and all that, who were baptized by John and are getting this sort of like thumbs up here.
Right.
I heard that as like the people who were baptized by John accept this praise of John because they were baptized by John. It reminded me of the way that like when I feel like I'm doing a really good job in my sort of fitness routine, I read the well section of the New York Times because it's like a big pat on the back to me. Yeah. Like I know I'm doing this stuff. So of course I accept whatever you're telling me. But when I'm not, like, it's more like you have identified with this group. And so you're accepting the message that is positive about this group. Mm-hmm. And so then reading the first part of that, like because the Pharisees and the lawyers had refused to be baptized by John, it's like it's a really different thing to speak so positively about John to them because they already are going to see themselves as sort of outside that. Like it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like it becomes harder and harder to hear the message the more the message is harsh towards the people who have already done things, and harsh towards people who have not done the things, and soft towards people who have done the things. So I think the way that I was looking at this before was much more just in terms of your past decision to be baptized or not baptized by John is going to direct the way you feel about this conversation. So that's what I thought about the first part of the verse. But then when it says, I softened a little bit about when it got to the part about God's purpose for themselves, because that felt less sort of group identity politics-y.
Now that's interesting that it's not, the Pharisees and legal experts, they didn't reject what Jesus had said, or they didn't reject the claims, they rejected God's will for themselves, which to me, I'm reading back into chapter 3, but maybe I shouldn't be. That John was calling people to bear the fruits, and the Pharisees got hung up on the theological concept and didn't bear the fruit. But you're right. It's being baptized by John is the thing, which suggests that the only way to truly bear the fruits of the kingdom is to be baptized by John here. I do think that's probably Luke's idea, is that if you truly were following God's will and you were recommitting your life in this way, you would have been baptized by John.
Mm-hmm.
And so scribes and Pharisees who were not baptized by John were thinking that they had already been justified themselves. And Luke's perspective is that they haven't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Amy, Jesus then moves on to this comparison about the current generation.
Yeah.
And he talks about these children in the marketplace crying out to each other. And then a reference to John being an ascetic and getting criticized, and Jesus eating and drinking and being called a glutton.
Mm-hmm.
Can you, how do you understand how this image fits together?
It is fascinating imagery. And when I will say, when I first read what we imagine these children called out to each other, before it was clear to me how I was supposed to feel about what they said.
Right.
I first read it as sort of they're doing these things that generally elicit a very human sort of almost empathetic or emotional response, not an intellectual response, but when you hear music, you dance.
Yeah.
And when you hear wailing, you weep. It seems very, it seemed like the accusation was sort of that, of sort of being disconnected from the humanity of a situation.
Oh, yeah.
That was a very positive reading. And then I went on and I was like, oh, no, that's not where we're going. I don't think that's where we're going at all.
Yeah.
Then it started to feel much more sort of manipulative. Dance, monkey, dance. We play the flute. You're supposed to dance. We should be driving the train here, and you should be doing what we want. And since you are not, you being both John the Baptist and Jesus, who are sort of not following the peer pressures of the time, as it were, you will find a way to criticize whatever they do.
Yeah.
If they're eating, they shouldn't be eating. And if they're not eating, then what's the matter with them? They should be, there's...
Right.
Yeah, this just sounds like middle school, man.
Yeah. I think if you inhabit your middle school self, this gets pretty close to what is happening here. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think your reading of it is probably the right one, that the people have, or at least what I think you said, the generation is like children who have an idea about what John and Jesus ought to be doing.
Yeah.
And whatever the expectation that they articulate is, they're going to be critical. And so, they say two different things. One is you should dance more, and one is you should weep more. And, John is a weeper, but they're criticizing Jesus for not weeping. And Jesus is a dancer, or at least a celebrator, and they're criticizing John because he isn't. And so it's like they're always finding the reason to complain. They're always taking the expectation that is not fulfilled and focusing on that.
Oh, I like that way of putting that. That's really helpful.
And so they could never get to a place where they could accept John or Jesus, because they're always going to pick at it from the other direction.
Right. And that is, if part of the overall critique here is really with people being too attached to definitions that they had about things from the past, or ideas of how things were going to go, Yes, I can testify assuredly that you can think one thought too many and just you can pull apart any idea. Like you can.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yep.
Yeah. So folks in the Bible Worm Collaborative, like you can read this as like one group of children, like picking on John and Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody in the Bible Worm Collaborative was suggesting that you have like two groups of children here criticizing each other, which I thought was kind of interesting. Like one group wants to be dancing and the other group wants to be weeping. And so what they're getting caught up on is what they think they need, and you don't think that's what we need. And so we can't play together because we have our own sort of set idea of what we should be doing, and it's not the same as yours. So this is about division within the generation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite as seeing that as clearly in my own reading, but I think it's interesting to sort of chase a little bit to say that people they don't just want Jesus and John, like they don't want just the Messiah to be present, but they want the Messiah to be present in a certain kind of way. And they can't agree on what that way is, so they find ways to separate themselves or something like that. Do you have any reflections on that way of thinking about it?
I can pretty easily see it as there are different expectations of what the Messiah ought to be doing. And some people say ought to be dancing, and some people say ought to be weeping. And it's clearly impossible to do both things, or,
right.
I don't know whether I guess I would have to follow that thread down a little bit further to imagine, whether those groups of people are able to peaceably coexist.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But it does. I mean, man, doesn't this sound like spiritual leadership, Bobby?
It's very.
Why aren't you weeping? Why aren't you dancing? Yeah. Why are you eating so much? What, no. It's hard.
It reminds me a little bit of trying to decide where to go out to eat when you're when you're in that hangry mood, and you and somebody else who's also hangry are trying. And so every suggestion the other person makes, you're like, no. And then you make your own suggestion. They're like, no. Whereas if somebody would just agree, like what matters is that we get to eat, And so like we're standing in the way of achieving what we actually want by picking at each other. That might be a way of getting into that idea.
They're spiritually hangry. They are.
Amy, the last thing Jesus says here is wisdom is proved to be right by all her descendants. That's not necessarily where I thought that was going to land, but that is where Jesus has landed it.
No, that is not where I would have thought that would have landed.
How do you make sense of where it does land?
I mean, do you think we're talking about like the sort of wisdom, capital W wisdom, like Lady Wisdom in the book of Proverbs kind of, that maybe was, present with God at the creation of like that kind of wisdom?
That's where my head has gone with it. Yeah, is that this is some sort of, reference to God sort of around the corner sort of thing. Like not a direct reference, but to an aspect of God.
So then are all of her children all humans or only the wise humans?
I think I would read it as maybe the wise humans. So the ones who get it by the way they live their life demonstrate.
So then, okay, the way you just said that tied it back in my mind to that line about God being justified.
Yes. That's the way I tend to put it together. But I'm not sure that's the only way it could be read, though.
Is there a particular way that fits for you? Like, why did we switch to talking about wisdom after this sort of like playground mockery scene?
Yeah, the like it works better to me if I ignore the word wisdom, which is probably not what you're supposed to do as a close reader of texts. I mean, I think that the children in the market have been demonstrating foolishness by wanting the other or wanting somebody else to do their thing. And so the wise one is the one who ignores all of that noise and just does what is right, maybe. I feel like I'm a little paraphrastic here. I'm just trying to make it fit.
Yeah, no, I could see that. And I could also see it possible that I'm almost trying to imagine how we would rewrite this almost poetically. Like there's a little sort of stanza that ends with a line and then a stanza that ends with a line, and that those are in parallel to each other. And that makes me a little less concerned about wisdom.
Yeah.
Needing to, if we think of wisdom as sort of an aspect or an emanation from God, then.
Because you've got a distinction here. Like verse 31 is the people of this generation, like the descendants of this world in which we live. And then verse 35 is the descendants of wisdom. And so these two groups are being contrasted in that way, maybe similar to the divisions that we've had previously.
Yeah.
All right, Amy. Well, when you look at this passage as a whole, from John's sending his disciples down through these children mocking each other in the marketplace, where is your head connecting to our own time and place?
Bobby, I am so taken by this idea that sort of John is in this story like a critical leader who has opened doors and pathways for people really concretely, and maybe also can't quite walk through the doorway himself.
Yeah.
And maybe that's okay. Like it's reminding me of Moses leading the people to the promised land and standing on the mountains looking at the promised land, and God saying, you're not going to go in.
Yeah.
And it's sad that he's not, but also he is enormously honored. Like he is a, tremendously honored leader in our history. And also that doesn't mean the sky's the limit. It just means you have a certain role that you need to fulfill in this story. And, for a minute I was thinking about the, like so harsh on the Pharisees and lawyers who also don't get it. But I think the fact that the text says like, but that was you denied God's path for you. Like God wanted you to do that part.
Yeah.
So I think what it's making me what it's making me think about is how like it's not the like looking at the outcome of someone's life that lets you determine that they did or didn't do all that was meant for them to do, because it's differentiated, and it's kind of for us to wrestle individually and sort of go as far as we can and as far as we are called to do, and try not to be sort of weighed down by our past or by ideas, but be inspired by them. But it's not like a race. It's not like whoever gets the farthest is the winner, because we are all on our own journey. We all have our own sort of path, and we have to trust. That. That doesn't anchor very well in like today. What does that mean for today? I don't know what that means for today.
Yeah.
I mean, it is helpful to me in my own life at this moment. It's not really a commentary on the world, I guess, but I just think it's sort of like a non-competitive religious worldview. That people need
I like
to
that.
Be where they are.
I like that.
What are you thinking, Bobby?
I think where I'm really drawn in this week's text is this kind of ongoing theme about Jesus as a stumbling block, and that people's ideas about who Jesus should be or must be get in the way of them actually experiencing the fullness of the presence of the Messiah. It happens to the scribes and the Pharisees here, but it also happens to John the Baptist here. And to me, that's a little bit comforting in a sense, because like John, the greatest prophet who ever was, according to this text anyway, who knew who Jesus was all the way back in the womb, he got tripped up. And so it makes me feel a little more like, okay, well, sometimes I get tripped up. And so that's probably okay too. Like to me, that's helpful. Like, I don't have to get it right maybe all
Yeah.
the time.
Mm-hmm.
But the place this text really resonates for me is Jesus doesn't engage in a propositional debate about messiahness. When John says, "Are you the one?" he doesn't say, "Haven't you read the Council of Chalcedon where it says, Jesus is fully divine and fully human and all that stuff?" Like, he doesn't talk about that, and he doesn't go back and say, "Here's the job description of Messiah. Like, didn't you read that?"
Yeah.
He demonstrates, and what he demonstrates is breadth of healing and good news to the poor. And he's like, the implication is that's what you need to see. All these propositional arguments that you're making, or all these claims about special status because you belong to the elect or whatever, like, these things are not important. And the games you're playing in the market about whether people should be dancing or mourning, those are not important. What matters is that there is healing being done and good news being proclaimed to the poor. And the intellectual, like, you can play intellectual games around it, but that's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I really love that because it frees us up from these sort of intramural arguments that we have with other people about exactly the way the religion is supposed to be and what we're supposed to believe and what creeds we're supposed to follow or whatever. And it just says there is a core to it. And you can tell when you're near the Messiah because these are the things that are happening.
Yeah.
And you don't have to agree about how, and you don't have to argue about why, but that's the thing. And I just think that's really beautiful and also a good benchmark, for my own communities when we say, are we being faithful to the gospel? I mean, we could talk about whether we're living out the creeds or whatever, but it's simpler and maybe more Jesus-like just to say, are people being healed? Is good news being proclaimed to the poor?
Yeah.
If so, then stop asking the questions that are going to trip you up.
Yeah.
And just let it be. That's good enough. Like, lean into that feeling. I think that's a really lovely message for today.
I think that's beautiful. Yeah.
All right, Amy. Well, next week we are going to continue on, I think maybe with another text that we've never read together, although we've read one. This is a story of a woman anointing Jesus's feet with oil. We have, I know, read another version of this story from the Gospel of John in our economics series. This is Luke's version of that story, which goes somewhat differently in Luke chapter 7, 36 to 50.
Now I'm trying to imagine all the ways it could go differently. And in my head, it turned into some kind of like very slippery, like sliding across the room with your oily feet.
Yeah.
That probably is
like
not
the
what
blooper reel.
Yeah, like-
probably not.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, Amy. Well, I appreciated this conversation so much, and I will see you again next time.
Me too. That sounds great, Bobby. Have a good one.
You too. Bye. Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of Bible Worm. If you've enjoyed this free podcast, we hope you'll help us keep it going by joining our Patreon for as little as $4 per month. You can also sign up for other goodies like early access, video lectures, weekly liturgies, and more. Visit patreon.com/BibleWormPodcast for details.
Bible Worm is produced and edited by Bobby Williamson. Our theme song is sung by Colin Bagby, and our theme music is The World at Large by Dano Songs. Many thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping make this podcast possible.
Join us again next time when we'll discuss Luke 7:36 to 50, the story of a woman anointing the feet of Jesus. Until then, keep on digging.